Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News Chief Political Anchor Bret Baier.
For my new book coming out in June ahead of the 250th anniversary of the country called The Case for America, I traveled the country asking people one simple question: what makes this country worth it? I recently sat down with Douglas Brinkley. He's a historian and professor over at Rice University to get his take on our national identity. Here's our full conversation. So this is part of a project I've been working on for a while. It's The Case for America. And it's a bunch of interviews, but it's also tapping into all the stuff I've done with the 6 biographies. But it's business people, it's historians like yourself, it's a number of different leaders, Condi Rice and others, talking about if you're making the case for America as we get ready for this 250th, what that feels like, looks like. The founders obviously often spoke of the virtue being a key component of free society. In particular, they spoke of civic virtue. Why is that an idea that's significant, do you think, for America?
Whenever I teach presidential history, I like to begin with George Washington at 14 years old, where he actually recorded in his handwriting 110 ideas of what civility should be. And it's important, not just because he did this when he was 14, and he was building on philosophy and Jesuit thinking, actually, but it's important because he kept it with him his whole life. He lived by this civility. And it showed how Washington was able to pull the Continental Army together. It tells you how he was able to become first president, because he was never rude or put offish, and he lived by this sort of code. And and then there became the great debate on civic virtue, which is part of our founding. And many of our great founders, James Madison in particular, were worried about, can we keep our democracy if we don't have civic virtue, which is basically truth and honesty, and in a democracy, people at a local level caring about following the same kind of ethical code. And there's been a deterioration of that in recent times. And so there's kind of a movement now to start teaching civics in school again, to start talking about American government, to talk about what it means to participate. That I think is a really good thing. And I tell young people, read Washington, and then move forward from that.
Yeah, and as we get to the 250th, hopefully that's a renaissance of some of that. What do you see as the primary value?
The big one that I've always gravitated toward was this idea of westward expansion, or Americans in motion. Anybody who's in the U.S. has this sort of, a heritage where they came here from somewhere else. And even indigenous peoples and tribal situations moved constantly. And so there's kind of there used to be called the Frederick Jackson Turner frontier ethic, that we just kept moving westward. And by the time we hit California and that was developed, we started with the Spanish-American War, Philippines and Hawaii. And then, we keep going. And in fact, when John F. Kennedy sold the moonshot in a bipartisan way, he would constantly frame it as a new frontier, that first it was the journey on the seas, and then across the continent, and now we're going into the stars, aiming for the moon and beyond. There's a kind of frenetic, motion-driven aspect to American life. And the idea is you're not married to a caste system. If you grew up in, Richmond, Virginia, and you don't like it, you can move to Phoenix and change your name. Well, you can't do that in Belgium. Everybody knows you, and they're constantly looking at, your chart. So there is a kind of Horatio Alger democratic ethos, which is there, and I think it's important. And obviously, what is democracy? What is liberty? And we are a nation of laws, and those become, I think, the primary things to focus on.
But in essence, that first part is about opportunity, right?
Yes, and even if you came over in a non-opportunity way, meaning you came over through slavery, once you got here, it was still the journey. You still had the movement here into a new place, trying to define who you are. So there's really omni-Americans. There are all sorts of people here, and it's a shared instinct. No matter race, religion, by and large, if you travel abroad, if you're in college and you go abroad, Americans recognize each other. There's something culturally, linguistically, energy focused that says that's an American. And sometimes we forget that kind of shared identity we have. And then the art of being okay to like your enemy, that's often hard, particularly in the Civil War or even in the fights of our politics of today. But learn that the people that disagree with you might have values, and you can have friendships. And after all, you're sending your kids to often the same public schools, and we're teaching our children to kind of get along.
As we come to this 250th, America has shown great resilience in our 250 years, and it always comes back from the brink. What lesson does that kind of teach us for current times?
That the United States was built to last. That too many people think we're on the verge of collapse. And I feel it's there that when we get in that mode, we're not looking at all the adversities of the past. If you really study history and understand the Civil War in earnest, and if you really look at the price our country paid in Korean War, World War I, World War II, and what our soldiers have done around the world, and to make our lives where we can have the dream of just air conditioning and sewage and medical service. I mean, there's still an envy of the world, the United States, to come here because our combination of democracy, capitalism, and the part that's hard to define, the civic virtue, this kind of Good Samaritan aspect that comes out of the Bible, comes out of political documents. And I think we get hung up sometimes too much because of the court system on what the founders thought, but the elasticity of our Constitution and the way it's changed over a period of time, it proves that it's quite durable, and that the key thing is to always remember that our own times aren't uniquely perilous. It can feel like every day this is the biggest crisis that ever hit, particularly in a rather new world of internet, social media. The tabloid headline can get hyped, but a lot of things are working well in the United States right now, and the ones that aren't, we got to fix.
In other words, we've been dark places before.
Very dark.
Figure our way out.
Yeah, and when I said, we think of our foundation at 250, you think of the Declaration of Independence, as we should, the Bill of Rights, Constitution, Federalist Papers. But then there are things like Lewis and Clark journals are almost foundational, or the Northwest Ordinance. And then you get to Lincoln, and it's just raining foundational second, wave documents like his first inaugural, his second inaugural, Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg Address. And I think in modern times, probably Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech can be almost seen as a foundational document now. And maybe Seneca Falls, women's movement for voting. And so we need just, though, to teach American history. I'm afraid, Bret, we're lagging behind in doing that. We're going to get back to letting people understand the past of this country and the fact that our flag means something.
All right, we're going to take a quick pause here. We'll be back after this. Do you sense that the 250th is kind of an effort to...
It is. Every 50 years kind of becomes a moment, but 250 is a big one, and particularly in the age of Trump, because it's become very polarized, or the age of Biden, Obama versus Trump, and we got to kind of pull together on America 250. I know they're building Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library opening in North Dakota. We can talk about all aspects of American history, but I hope for a month of July that we can recognize what our kinfolk had to go through. My would-be uncle, my mom's brother, was killed at Iwo Jima and by a sniper. And I was recently reading about that experience and doing a little research. And it's like, my God, when you think about what we did in World War II, industrial mobilization and how everybody said, yes, send me. It's just remarkable. And I don't think of World War II as the greatest generation, but I do think there's a lot to learn about that kind of belief in public service and country.
If you were pressed to have to make the case for America, if you were pressed to have to make a case for America ahead of this 250th, how would you do it?
That we were able to break the shackles of Europe when our country was founded. I would focus on the winning of the American Revolution. I would focus on the tradition of the presidency with George Washington. I think we can also be very proud in America 250, not just on politics or military affairs or statesmen's behavior, but art and culture. I mean, when you go back and read people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Louisa May Alcott or Henry David Thoreau or Walt Whitman, or then go and read, W.E.B. Du Bois or Willa Cather, or listen to the music of Miles Davis or Chuck Berry or Hank Williams and Johnny Cash, and you could kind of feel this Americana feel. There's just a feel about the United States, the American spirit. And it manifests itself at all sorts of different times. So you can find it by just standing to the national anthem at a baseball game, but you can also read a short story, by William Faulkner and say, wow, how did Mississippi produce a writer that good?
Uniquely American.
Uniquely American. And that's what my life is. I try to love the country and I love our artists. And we're not looking for a litmus test about art, like this person I agree with or don't. It's just to make sure we're able to have the freedom of speech and the freedom of individual presentation. I guess the First Amendment overall, if say it, do it, say what you think, without being incendiary, but make sure that you realize your individuality matters, as does the collective identity of the 50 states as a united economic and cultural and political engine for the world.
Last thing, is there an anecdote from history that stands out for you as a sign of America's promise?
I mentioned, Bret, to you, foundational documents. I dipped into and read recently the correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And the fact that they really disagreed on a lot. I mean, just boil it down. I mean, John Adams of Massachusetts insisted till his dying day that the Revolutionary War was triggered by the Boston Massacre. And Jefferson said, no, it was Patrick Henry in Virginia. I mean, it was a big disagreement. And then in the 1800 election, which created our political parties, they just went at each other. The Federalists, of Adams versus the Democrat Republicans of Jefferson. It was brutal. But here, as old codgers, as survivors of the great meetings in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, they started writing each other about things, and they do little barbs. But when you read them, you realize that at the end, I saw that happen with Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, who became the closest of friends, that you can heal those rifts in the end. And so I find that the fact that they both died on July 4th, at the same day, Jefferson and Adams, and later, James Monroe died on that group. I always go back to those, the brilliant minds of Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, and Madison, and how they anticipated, what we would need to do to be able to have a 250th anniversary. And I can't help but thinking how Jefferson in particular would have marveled at space technology, or, Adams would have been fascinated by cargo shipping and all of these things in the industrial economic sector that have provided, a standard of living in the United States that it would make them proud.
I mean, for the people who question whether the Constitution can operate now, we are so past where the Founding Fathers were, and yet when it gets tested, it does stand the test of time. How do you respond to that as we get to this moment?
Well, I think we're sometimes we're all of us really are afflicted with presentism, that idea with a capital P that everything right now is dysfunctional. But with the longer sweep of American history, things start looking differently 40 years, 50 years from now, what we're going through right now. For example, in the FDR era, the long shadow of Franklin D. Roosevelt. 4 times, he's president. And believe me, there are people that didn't like FDR. And, the tilting of Supreme Court towards a more progressive, William O. Douglas interpretation, let's say. And now you see a pendulum going another way in the Roberts Court, and it'll probably go in a different direction later. And it's worked, but it doesn't come without bumps and grinds and potholes. And it's in the end, the amount of great legal thinking that's occurred in our country, there's nothing like it. The question is just, though, how to get back to some civic virtues so we're feeling fellowship with people that live around us and people that you're meeting in your daily life, and trying to keep some of the more old-fashioned gentility and kindness alive.
Hopefully the 250th does that. Doug, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bret.
Thank you for listening. You can get my book, The Case for America, available June 16th, wherever books are sold.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.